I'm Matthew Green. I'm climate correspondent at Reuters, and I'm here with Lady Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, who is founder of the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism and CEO of a family office, EC Rothschild, which is focused on investing for the long term. Lynn, thank you very much for joining us. I'm curious about this word healing. We were speaking a minute ago about the great clamor for healing that we're seeing around the world, whether it's in relation to the climate crisis, whether it's in relation to the oppression that we're seeing in so many countries, particularly exemplified with the protests sweeping across the US and other countries at the moment. Where do capitalism and healing come together?
It's a great question. It's a great question. In its ideal form, capitalism would be the strongest force for healing and for goodness on the planet that men and women can pursue. So I think they are. It's a great question, and I think they're very much related. I think very sadly, we are in the midst of a storm right now, a trifecta of a pandemic, unemployment levels that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, and then social unrest based on racial injustice. And the storm that that's creating has got to be an opportunity as a society for us to not just recover and go back to where we were, but to regenerate and be something different as a form of capitalism so that we can heal the wounds of inequality and injustice and a degraded planet. And so I think there's a real correlation between healing and capitalism. And I think now is the time when government, business leaders, any employee, any worker, any consumer needs to come to the table to figure out how things will change. And I think that's why we're seeing the protests. I think the protests are a form of people saying, we are not going to settle for the way things used to be.
It's a tantalizing prospect in a way, isn't it? The idea that we can change the system, in a sense, reform without perhaps revolution, perhaps. We've had a long period of time where shareholder value was very much the mantra of corporate leaders. There's now more talk about stakeholder capitalism. Can we turn this tank around in time, do you think?
Well, I think if we don't, it will be at our own peril. I think shareholder capitalism, which essentially said the purpose of a corporation was to profit its shareholders, period, or what do you say? You don't say, you say full stop in the English language. That has been completely discredited, even from the people who were its greatest practitioners. And we've seen where that has led to. It's led to inequality. It's led to a planet that is dirty, and the people who are making it dirty don't pay for it. So stakeholder capitalism is the only answer. And what that means is that a company exists for the purpose of its consumers, its employees, its communities, and of course its shareholders. Shareholders can't be expected to go to zero, but a company needs to have a purpose. As Colin Meyer has said in The Future of the Corporation Project, a company's purpose has to be to solve the problems of people and planet profitably, not to profit from creating problems for people and planet. So that shift has to happen. And if this trifecta of trouble in the world is not enough to cause government leaders to be bolder, we can't retread the ideas of the past. Government, corporate leaders, they also have to step up. And we are seeing a lot of it. It's very interesting now in this racial justice crisis what companies are saying and where they're putting some money. But as Darren Walker said, let's see what these companies are doing in 1 year and make sure it's not a flash in the pan, because we can no longer cover over these problems. We need fundamental change. And we as a group, we have been in communications with the Vatican. And this is something that Pope Francis thinks about. And he used the words regeneration, not recovery. What will we turn into? And we have got to turn into a stakeholder model economy. And we have to understand our requirement to take care of people and planet. And investors need to be a big part of this. Investors need to invest for the long term and create what I call a race to the top, where the companies that are doing the best things for their people and their planet become the most valuable. And I believe when you look at the way millennials want to invest, when you look at the $30 trillion that have committed to PRI, Principles for Responsible Investing, you see money wants to go to these companies. So if we have government, investors, CEOs, customers, and employees on the same track, never in full agreement, because everyone's got a little different view of how it should work, but we have to come together and start making real changes. And I believe it's government at this point that needs to lead the way.
I wondered if you could maybe talk about some examples of work you've been involved with, or changes you're seeing at the moment that might give us some hope in a way that perhaps this new thinking that you're describing could become more of a mainstream agenda. Because obviously there's a growing discussion in the financial community about ESG, about sustainability. But at the end of the day, companies are still looking at their quarterly results and feeding this machine, or turning the wheels of this giant machine. Are we seeing any glimmers of how that machine might be tamed in some sense?
You know, Matthew, yes, I think that we really are. I think take a look at what Bernhard Looney did at BP. I mean, he made an amazing commitment, which he's going to fill in the details of in the autumn. But that was not evolutionary. That was revolutionary. And he seems to understand that energy companies need to use their scale to create positive change for the planet. So I put that out there as an example. I put Salesforce out as an example. They have always committed to 1%, 1%, 1% of profit and employee time, and donations going from revenue to basically justice. I think they're the real deal. I think a lot of companies are indeed stepping up to do the real thing. And I think if you look at the International Business Council in Davos last year, it was this year actually, right? It was just.
Yeah, it seems like it was in another historical era, but yeah, it was only a few months ago, right?
Exactly. 140 companies did sign up to measurable commitments to take care of people and planet and communities. So it's not done yet. We have a Securities and Exchange Commission here that regulates the securities markets, and they are beginning to show willingness to require disclosure on workers. This administration won't require it on climate, but another administration, I think, probably would. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but everything is about concrete actions now. Everything is about making real commitments and being measured against them. And as a society, I also believe we need to forgive. So if someone makes a commitment to 30% gender and racial diversity in the top ranks of their company by 2030, and they miss it by a few points or by a few years, they still deserve credit for trying. And so we need in order to get the healing that you referred to in your first question, we also need a spirit of forgiveness, and we need a spirit of trust. And trust has been shown to be the most important consumer driver, right? And trust is based on companies doing what they say they will do. And so it's in everyone's interest to walk the talk, to act in ways that create more inclusivity and more sustainability.
I'm curious because I suspect you possibly spend more time rubbing shoulders with senior business executives than I get the opportunity to do. And I'm wondering, post-pandemic, we've been through this extraordinary shared experience. Obviously, the impact on people who are at the on the margins of society is obviously been many times worse than it has been for those who are running businesses or at the essentially top of the ladder in a socioeconomic sense. But I'm still curious about whether you're detecting any sort of signs of a kind of shift in consciousness among that class of people who are basically running the economy. Do you think they've been shaken? Do you see something new, some new thinking beyond the kind of platitudes that we often hear around this topic? I just have an intuition that the change that we've just been through is perhaps more profound than we have yet necessarily assimilated. And I'm curious about whether you have any little anecdotes or examples you could share that might suggest there is something new emerging on the planet right now in response to this terrible tragedy that we've been through.
I am in contact with many chief executives who I know are on the journey toward being more inclusive and having companies that are more sustainable. Whether it is, again, Mark Benioff is a great example, or Joe Kaiser, the CEO of Siemens, is really committed to this, or Ron O'Hanley, who runs State Street, or Oliver Bata, who runs Allianz. These CEOs are all making concrete commitments to things like net zero, to diversity. Now, I wrote a piece in the FT about 2 or 3 weeks ago where I called for mandatory disclosure requirements, because if they're not mandatory, they're not standardized, and customers and investors don't know what they're investing in. And regulated, standardized metrics will not be perfect. They have to be different for each industry, but I argued for it. And one comment that I made was that JP Morgan, in their proxy statement, was urging people to vote against diversity reporting and climate reporting. And I said, enough, that has to end. And Jamie Dimon, talked to me about this. And he said, Lynn, first of all, we do all of this. And I know that to be a fact. JP Morgan, in community work, in the climate work, in the diversity, I wouldn't be surprised there's going to be a woman CEO of that bank probably pretty soon. So it is great on all of these issues. But they wanted their shareholders to vote against disclosure because a proxy had come in with very detailed, very expensive, very unworkable metrics. And so Jamie's right. He had to say no to that, although he's in favor of mandatory disclosures. So I think there are lots of chief executives who are with the program in general, but are being hit from too many sides. And if we can sort of calm down, be truly committed and create change, I think we will bring the investment, the the investment community, the CEO community, the policymaker community, and probably most importantly, the public and the consumers along on this reinvention of capitalism, which I hope will be inclusive.
I'd love to round off out with a question that just listening to you speak has just come to me. And I'm really curious, what is the strategy now to influence these CEOs? A lot of them men, not always, but a lot of them of a certain generation. We've seen this kind of huge clamor for change from many, whether it was huge climate strikes last year, we're now seeing protests around the world about the oppression of racial minorities. What is the way to kind of push these guys or pull them or cajole them or whatever it is you do to move faster?
Well, we're doing everything we can think of. And I believe it's push and it's pull. I believe that you pull people toward you by being reasonable and by appealing to people's moral sense as well as their pragmatic sense. That if we live with a planet that's completely decayed or with a society that's completely divided, that's not good for business. So I believe we pull people with self-interest and morality, and then also by having investors who are willing to say, okay, we know to fix your energy platform is going to take money over this number of years. We'll do that. Give us our share. Don't turn your back on shareholders, but do the whole thing. So I think you pull by that, and I think you push by government. When I started the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism, I was dead set against having any political involvement. And I now think that was wrong. And we are in fact working on, for the United States, some policy ideas to help the American worker, which we'll be releasing the end of the year. So it's push and pull, but it starts from a place in people's heart and mind that the horror that we're seeing cannot continue. The inequality is horrendous and unfair, not sustainable, and we all have to give up something, whether we pay more for a product because it's made sustainably, or we receive a lower dividend because a company is investing in their workforce. As long as those things are happening in a proportionate way, I think it's fine. But I do think it needs the push of government. I am now in favor of that, personally.
Lady Lynn, thank you so much for speaking to Reuters. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we'll have a chance to compare notes again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Hope to see you soon.